Hello, this is Historical Fiction with Kitoslav, and today I wanted to talk about an author that I haven't seen talked about much on, well, I actually haven't seen talked about at all on YouTube before there, but I think he's quite one that deserves to be talked about here. I would like to talk about the writer Nigel Tranter there, who, as far as I know, is pretty much the authority when it comes to Scottish historical fiction there. He had an extremely long career writing books centered on Scottish history for I think all the way up until his death in about the year 2000 there. So from the 50s until then, here's a list of some of the books that he wrote and his topics. I think he went from kind of very early Roman age, uh, kind of, or a little bit later Scottish history. If he's got something there on King Kenneth MacAlpin there, um, on Macbeth and so on, all the way up through the wars of Scottish independence there, and I think he had quite a lot on the Stuarts there up until the 1800s or so there. So he was very much kind of an authority on Scottish history. He was a historian as well, and he wrote quite a lot about Scottish history. And like any, I think obviously I'm not any kind of expert on Scottish history, but I think anyone who's interested in history, can really appreciate the long and complicated history there. In fact, I think I bought this. I went one of the places on my honeymoon that visited. We visited Scotland there, and I think I bought this in a bookshop in Edinburgh there on my actual honeymoon. So I actually got this one from Scotland, so it's very authentic. And this one is the only one that I actually own. I've read a few other ones. I think some books that I've sold. I think I read, or is it Black Douglas, which is about the one of the Douglas clan members there, and yeah, so I've read a few others. I can't remember. Ones generally they've kind of passed through my hands, but this is the only one that I actually own by Nigel Tranter, and I think this is probably one of his most famous series here. This is actually a three-volume trilogy, all packed into one book, so it's well over 1,000 pages there, and it contains the stories The Steps to the Empty Throne, Path of the Hero King, and Price of the King's Peace. So it's very much historical fiction based around the King of Scotland, Robert the Bruce there. And the first novel, Steps to the Empty Throne, talks about kind of his inspiration from the hero William Wallace there, and up until he gained the crown of Scotland there. And the second one talks about him kind of consolidating his consolidating his power there, all the way up until the famous Battle of Bannockburn there. And then the third novel kind of is actually after Bannockburn, and kind of shows the difficulty of keeping the kingdom together. The attempt to unify Ireland to Scotland there, and really lots of good stuff. I mean, Tranter was a historian, so I think that he, I would vouch for the writing here as being relatively nice and authentic. But I've actually read this one twice. I read it recently a few years ago, and I noticed the second time that I read it, I actually got a lot more from it, because I actually followed the map, which I recommend to anyone who's, unless you're intimately familiar with the map of Scotland there. I found this really helpful, because Robert the Bruce was traveling around quite a lot throughout his story there. I think he was the Earl of Carrick there, which is kind of in the south, but he obviously traveled basically the length and breadth of Scotland throughout his story there. There was, it really does show him as amazingly heroic there. There was one point I think where his entire entourage was down to 12 men after he'd been crowned, and the entire country had been basically conquered by Edward the First, who, yeah, he Edward the First, Longshanks, really comes off as quite a tyrant here when you see some of the things that he inflicts, and I think that's historically accurate. I mean, the guy actually had the hammer of the Scots written on his grave there, so he really had it in for the Scots there. So I don't think there's any kind of exaggeration there. I mean, the good thing is Tranter, he is very balanced, in his approach. Obviously, he's writing about a Scottish hero here, but he does show the evil on both sides, and he's not afraid to show how much kind of treason and backstabbing there was particularly among the Scottish nobility at those times there. So I think he's really nice and balanced. I like his style there. I can see how some people might not like it. What my criticism of him might be, generally when you're reading historical fiction, I think most of us we accept the fact that some writers might omit certain characters or omit certain details when they're relating the history, but Tranter really doesn't omit anything. There's a huge cast of characters. You really have to use the refer back to it quite a lot, because it's very difficult to keep all of the characters in mind, and he seems to want everyone who participated wanted to, he shows that they were there. I don't think he skips over any characters through any of the stories there. So it can be kind of a complex reading there, but it's really got some great characters throughout. Robert's wife, Marjorie, his Irish wife there, she's a fantastic character. And even his brother Edward, who's a real kind of hothead, and he's hard to like there, but you can really see how he and Bruce were kind of clashing heads, bashing heads quite a lot there. But overall, I think you'd learn a lot about that period of history there, with first kind of the conflict of Bruce and Edward the First, which kind of graduates into the conflict with Edward the Second, who is Bruce's kind of real enemy, real foe there. What was it, Edward Canaveron there, first Prince of Wales, and yeah, it's very quite kind of inspiring. I think these books were written in about 1969, 70, 71 or so there. And I think they're still generally considered probably the top historical fiction on that period, kind of the wars of Scottish independence there. So if you're interested at all, kind of I remember when we were in Scotland, we managed to visit some of the castles that were featured, and even visited Bannockburn, which there's really nothing there. It's it's an old battlefield, so there's really nothing to see there. But you got to see some of the famous sites there, and I think the castle in Stirling, I think it's actually was destroyed by Bruce and was rebuilt. So in later days, because most of the castles at that time were used to garrison English soldiers there, because they really had a stranglehold on the country. And you can see that kind of Bruce really was the one who kind of united and gave Scotland a sense of identity. As far as I can tell, I said I'm not in any way an expert on the country there, but I did find this would be a good recommend for me. I think it's really, if you're interested in the time period, and in the story there, I think it's a really great read. So thanks for listening.